Hi, I'm Val Walker, and I'm really excited to have our guest Laurie Whittemore here today and my co-host Robyn Houston-Bean. I'm a blogger for Psychology Today, and I also blog for the Health Story Collaborative. And interesting, doing this work with bringing people together to tell their stories about awe-inspiring and wondrous experiences. In other words, the healing power of awe and wonder. I have been finding a sense of community doing this. And I'm just very, very happy that it's a growing community of storytellers. And the videos that we record here are with different guests who come from all around. And we have different angles and different points of view and different ways we've been affected by moments of awe and wonder. Even a moment that was just maybe 10 seconds long that took your breath away can make a huge change in our lives. So we are here today to share one of our most important stories through a guest named Laurie Whittemore. But first, let's have some introductions. Robyn.
Thanks, Val. It's always wonderful to be here. My name is Robyn Houston-Bean. I am the founder of the Sun Will Rise Foundation. We provide peer grief support to people bereaved due to substance use related causes. And we currently have 31 monthly groups available to people. And I sit with people, and our other facilitators sit with people, and we hear these amazing stories that come up when people are talking about their grief of these awe-inspiring moments or wondrous moments that they've encountered after the death of their person. And we've not been able to share them outside of the circle. So when Val asked me to take part in this and have some of our grief group members take part as well, it was a no-brainer. I was like, absolutely, this would be exciting to share. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. And Reverend Laurie Whittemore, I'd love to hear a little about your background.
Sure, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be present with both of you today. I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in my senior year of college. I had been studying psychology, thinking about grad school, and realized I needed benefits. So when I had an opportunity to take a job with the government, I did. And I'll say more about that when I say my story. So I've worked for the government, left and went to seminary, and didn't have a traditional call. So my first on wonder story, which I'll tell, is about how I exited candidacy, and then went on to find alternative ways to serve in hospice, but then having a vision of what I felt ministry would look like. And so have become a chaplain trainer and founded during COVID a remote chaplain support organization that has chaplains call in on people. And it's just been a passion. I have some stories around that. And also, surprising to me, I was called to serve a church. I never thought that would be my call. And I love it. So that's me. And I have 2 kids, and I live in Maine, in a very beautiful neck of the woods, and I'm a grateful human being.
Well, Laurie, you happen to be the founder of the Spiritual Care Services of Maine. And I also believe you are a Unitarian minister.
Yes. Yes. Yep. Sorry about that. Left those 2 out.
Well, I'll make sure everybody knows that. That's just, yeah, you have a very amazing, well-rounded, you have the most versatile background. Well, I've been thinking a lot about experiences of awe and wonder that have particularly inspired people to follow a calling or to take action or to find a sense of purpose. And both Robyn and I think sort of bonded together to want to help co-host the Healing Through Wonder project because of our experiences of awe and wonder that truly led us to creating a whole new project, a whole new mission, a whole new form of service. For me, my experience with the great blue heron was so profound. I have a very deep, long story about that, but it was so profound. It not only changed my life, but it saved my life. And in a sense of gratitude and humility, but more than anything, a sense of inspiration from the power of a moment of awe and wonder. It's driven me, it's called me to want to write about it. So that's why I blog about it. I have a book I'm working on about it. But more importantly, it gave me a reason to set up a way of sharing our stories of these kinds of experiences. But in particular, this inspired me for this whole calling. And Robyn has a similar kind of thing.
Yes, it was with a dragonfly, and it was very profound. It was something that I had never experienced before. And I was in a period that I was very deep in my grief. And this moment helped propel me forward to let me know that I could go on without without my 20-year-old son anymore. And so when Val and I were able to share our two stories, they were very connected. And I had told, a few people that story a long time ago, and I kind of had put it away in my back pocket and forgot about it. And being able to share it again has brought this renewed sense of like purpose and like energy that I got from that awe and wonder moment. So I was really glad that Val was able to open that up in me again. And I'm hoping we're doing that for other people too, that they've had some moments that they haven't thought about. We're talking about different things, and then that triggers something in them to think about moments that they've had.
Yeah. And these kinds of triggers of awe and wonder can be from entirely different kinds of things. But Robyn and I did have experiences in the wilderness, in nature. My blue heron and your dragonfly in particular. We've had many other experiences of awe and wonder, but those were the ones that particularly made us feel that we had a mission. So on that note, Lori, I was curious about your story of what inspired you with your work or your sense of calling.
Yeah, it's so interesting too. As I'm hearing your stories, I'm feeling more pour in for me. So I feel like I have more to say than I thought I did. I think where I would start, I did talk about being diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in college, and I had to take my senior year off. I had a really profound onset. I was suffering from optic neuritis, so I was blind and I was paralyzed on my right side. And it was years ago, there were no medications, and my neurologist really didn't have the best bedside manner. And when I shared with him my deepest fears, as a 21-year-old female and not having children and all these things, I said, what am I to do? And he said, well, you know what? You can find a group home and you'll be just fine. And at that point, I went into denial, but not before being that ill, having large doses of steroids to stop the swelling, to stop the first onset. And they treated me very aggressively, and I stopped sleeping. And after about 4 or 5 days, I had a psychotic break. And during that psychotic break, I had visions, and was hospitalized for those visions. And they scared me, because just learning that your mind can do that, and take you out of reality is terrifying. And I shut down for years. I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. As soon as I could get out of the hospital, I told them anything they wanted to hear so that I could get out. And I denied what I was going through. My parents were like, it was just drug induced. That is not a part of you. You're not mentally ill. And that was, 30 or 40 years, 30 years ago. It was a long time ago. And mental illness did have a huge stigma. And so I had to deny it to move forward. But I knew at that point that I would be doing something. As I said, I had studied psychology, and I knew at that moment when I had that break, that what I was having was a break in my soul. And I needed a recovery of soul that psychology wasn't going to address. But, you know, then I compartmentalized it because I had to go on and deny it and push through my life. And so I took a job with the government because they had good benefits, and I knew I would probably need those. And I had a great career doing commercial real estate for the federal government, traveling from DC to Washington State to Alaska. I had such a great adventure. And you know, my doctor with the bad bedside manner said, "Well, you'll never run a marathon and you'll never have kids, but you'll have a fine life." And you know, as I entered denial, I was like, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna as soon as I can walk, if I can walk, I'm gonna run, and I'm gonna find a partner and have kids." And I was able to run a 10K. I did recover enough, and I've stayed recovered. Running is not my thing, so I'm glad I did that. But I'm done. Um, but you know, I found a partner, and we have two lovely daughters, and I always include them when I tell my story because it's a miracle to me that is the case. Um, and so I went about my business. We were living in Alaska when I had my first daughter. Um, we made our way back to Maine. The government transferred me here to a job, and that's where I had my second daughter. And after that, my MS really flared up. And I was consistently questioning, what am I doing? I love my job, but I can't do both. Um, and then 9/11 happened. And the work that I was going to be asked to do was all relative to going to New York and, you know, doing emergency work to get buildings in place and leases and all of these kinds of things. Our organization was going to have to set up a morgue on Governor's Island. I mean, just, you know, things that you never would think you'd have to do in your career. And at that moment, as I was sitting at my computer, I said, you know what? I want to be there right now, but I want to be there as a chaplain. That's when I knew. And so it didn't happen right away. I stayed as long as I physically could do the work, which wasn't a long time. But my minister had said, you know, I think you have a call. And so I started seminary. I left work and I started seminary. And I started a candidate process to become an ordained clergy person in the United Church of Christ. And all the while, I was in seminary and I was a candidate. I was not expressing what they would call an ordainable call. Didn't fit the box. Didn't think I wanted to take a church. That's how they ordain people. Didn't want to go be a hospital chaplain. You know, didn't have a traditional route. But I kept saying, I'm called. I know I'm called. I just can't tell you exactly what that looks like. Well, I got to the end. I will say that when you're a candidate, you have to do something called clinical pastoral education, which is spending time in a hospital being a chaplain. And I had shared with my supervisor that I had been hospitalized for psychiatric reasons. And he also was a sort of an elder in the church. And because I shared that, when I got to the ordination decision, because I wouldn't take a church and because I had a psychiatric diagnosis, they terminated my candidacy. And it was devastating. The church had been everything to me all my life and got me through some really hard times. And so I was devastated. My family was devastated. And we left the church at that point, which was, you know, when we probably needed it most for a lot of reasons. And it was at that time, I had a vision, and I don't know what precipitated it, but this was like 2011. By this point, I had a vision that what I was really being called to, I was being invited to create a chaplain organization that put chaplains in the world outside of institutions. Our country, our world has deinstitutionalized a lot of things like psychiatric health, mental health, substance use disorder. A lot of things have been taken out of institutions, and people are on streets, and people are, you know, in their homes and struggling. And so my vision was there has to be a way to make spiritual care accessible to them, because I look at it as not necessarily, I mean, it is a break in mental health, but it's a brokenness of soul. And if you don't address that, you can address specific behaviors or, obsessive compulsive disorder, all those things. But if you're not really working with someone's, deep sadness and brokenness, there's certainly chances of recidivism. I don't know what that word is, but I just wanted to sit with people, and I felt like there is a path for that. And so I tucked that away, and I went to the Chaplaincy Institute of Maine after all this happened, with my sight on training in interfaith chaplaincy and becoming ordained, because they had a track for that. And this kind of is the cornerstone of my next kind of extraordinary spiritual experience. After all of that hurt, and then finding my way through Chime, is what it's called, I felt so much healing because I could see my vision sort of tightening up. And when I was getting in the car and riding to go to my ordination, a friend of mine was driving, and I looked over, and a hawk had flown down and was flying parallel to the car. And hawks have always been important to me. So to see that kind of flying alongside me was this enormous healing. Like, oh yeah, this is where I was supposed to be. I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be. And it broke through that hurt so that I could then kind of focus on the vision in a bigger manner. I think being stuck in that grief and stuck in that pain really closed me off to being a lot of things, about being collaborative, about trusting people to work with me and not against me. And so that, just having that bird on my shoulder was like, okay, yeah, you're right where you're supposed to be. This is you're I don't ever say you've arrived, but you are headed on the right path. And that was really a transition from 10 years of hurt and pain. I guess it wasn't 10 years. I guess it was more like 5, but from that deep pain to, all right, really God did have a plan. And then that, that's led to that was all back in like 2015. Work that I'd done with the Red Cross afterwards, and with Maine Responds, doing disaster response, and building chaplain teams to do those sorts of things, prepared me for COVID. And then the state reached out to me and said, could you be a part of a community response line that supports people who are isolated as a result of a diagnosis? So as a volunteer, on a volunteer basis, I set up a team, and then I started my doctoral program at the same time, and really came to understand, well, if you can do this as volunteers, why can't this be a nonprofit? Why can't you do this just like you envisioned how many years ago, right? And I was able to do that using the framework of my seminary work. I went to the George Fox Seminary in Portland, Oregon, and they have a Portland Seminary is what it's called. And they had the structure for research and all of those things, which allowed me to put together a working plan, and then was able to launch it. And we made it through COVID, theoretically. So we made it through COVID funds, and our work was unbelievable. We had touched over 1,200 people in the course of a year, and identified all kinds of data, like, isolation was really the biggest factor of people wanting us to return calls to them, to check in on them. Isolation, substance use, homelessness. We had more contacts with unhoused people than we did anyone else. And it was profound. So we were able to present that data to the state, and they said we would make another contract with you for the next year to continue your work and expand it. And so we were doing remote work, and then we were able to then actually go out and be in the Homeless Services Center in Portland, the Living Room, which is a psychiatric crisis unit for the unhoused in Portland. We were in a couple of jails. And sadly, this contract is coming to an end, and we're trying to reinvent ourselves. But it's really, it completely brought to life the vision I had back in 2011.
Mm.
What an amazing, like, changeable course that you were on, but like you had that feeling so long ago and took all that time to get there. And then to have the hawk as that moment of absolutely, this is the right thing at
Was,
the right
yeah,
time. Just
Yep.
perfect.
Yeah.
was. But the hawk to me shows the courage. To me, it was saying, um, you know, I think it was also just a way of encapsulating your courage to have ventured in, into this unknown territory that nobody had ever gone before, and the hawks, like, to me, hawks often, they're for courage and bravery for a lot of us, I think. But anyway, that's more than 2 cents. I said,
Well,
I'm just
what's
thinking out
interesting.
loud.
Well, what's interesting is, and I didn't go that far back that I suppose I could have, but um, to give a little more context to why I feel like this vision came to pass. I grew up. My mother was an unwed mother, and she was Catholic, and then she married a divorced man, and the church excommunicated her. And so she always felt it important to bring me up in a church, but she couldn't go back to her church of origin. So she brought me up in the United Church of Christ. When I was 11, I started going to an evangelical church with my neighbors because I wanted to hang out with the kids, and had an experience of, had a couple of experiences which were very unpleasant, made me question the authority of my parents. And um, I was already having theological questions at 11, which nobody would answer. But at any rate, so I left and went back to the UCC. And when I lived in other parts of the world, there weren't a lot of UCCs, so I attend Episcopal churches. And I say all that because at some point I'm like, we're all on the same, this is my belief. Uh, we're all, there are many paths up the same mountain. We can call it what we want, but the source of all of creation is open to all of us. And so wanting to be a chaplain and be out in the world partially was to, validate that everybody's okay, everybody's perfect as they are. Yeah. So my hope was always based on my experience in different religions, some not so good experience. I always had a strong faith was to become and embody a religious leader who validated that everybody was a beloved child of whatever they want to call the ultimate source. And what's interesting, I grew up UCC, felt called to ministry in the UCC, but it turns out, after all, when I got, I think 3 or 4 years ago, invited to preach at a Unitarian Universalist church, and I got invited back, and then they invited me to be their pastor. Turns out I was a Unitarian Universalist all along.
Yeah.
Sort of that universalist perspective that everybody has access to all of it. And so, and funny how that works out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the story path of, though, had you got a church at the very beginning, your story wouldn't have taken on and helped all these different people, and then you end up at this place that you are now. I could have used you back in the day. I'm a non-practicing Catholic, but when Nick died, brought to our knees, and immediately there was a church, at the end of our street that we would occasionally go to. And my husband and I walked down the street, and we went to just open it, just to go sit there, just to sit there and try to understand what had happened. This was in like the first, day or so of Nick dying, and the door was locked. And we walked across the street to the rectory and to ring the bell to be like, and there was a sign that said, sorry, not at this rectory this week or whatever. And it would have been wonderful to have a call, someone to call
Yeah.
and just to be there to support me, during that moment, because it felt very I felt alone. It made me feel even more alone when that door was locked, you know? So
Yeah.
my heart, as you're talking about what you do, and I just think that's amazing. So thank you, Laurie, for all of that.
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, you're welcome. And that's a hard story to hear.
Yeah.
To think that in that moment of great grief that that there wasn't anyone there in that capacity. But that's why I feel like that's what I was called to do, because not everybody grieves in the four walls of a church. And churches, yeah, interesting factoids is that Maine is like the least churched state in the country. And you know, recent religious surveys show that like liberal Protestantism is now neck and neck, equal to evangelical Protestantism, which is a little bit more than Catholicism. But I mean, I think it's something like 68% of the state is not affiliated with a formal congregation or doesn't even identify. And then you have, you know, some of the minority religions coming in that are taking hold because new Mainers tend to follow their own traditions very strongly so they can keep a sense of community over here. So having that kind of spiritual support in outside of a faith community, since people aren't attending, is really, really important. And the other thing that's happening, which I want to note, is, you know, there's a really prescribed formula for training for a clinical chaplain to do things responsibly and not proselytize and all those things. And anybody from any faith tradition can become a clinical chaplain. In fact, there are humanist chaplains.
What about you? You told us about that moment with the hawk. I'm just curious if you've had other experiences of all that have, I don't know, continued to inspire you or opened you up in other ways.
Well, you know, I hadn't really put it all together until our first conversation on the phone. But you know, birds do tell me stories. It's interesting. There was a pivotal moment in my marriage, and my husband and I were taking a walk in the park near our house, and beautiful tall trees, very wooded. And we looked up, and there were three owls looking at us. And you know, we just were like, "Wow!" And you know, we were having a deep conversation, and it silenced us because we were in awe. And I think that made space for what would come next in the conversation. And the reason I remember that is because we were taking a walk in another park like a week ago, and there was an owl there. Now, luckily, we didn't have much to talk about, but we were kind of recounting, like, do you remember when? And so I feel like, you know, birds have great meaning to me. And I've always been a fan of the pink flamingo. And so they don't show up well, they have showed up in my yard in the plastic form. But what's interesting to me is that because people know that about me, there have been times in my life when I've, you know, been struggling with one thing or another, and a pink flamingo will end up in my mailbox, or, you know,
Gosh.
it's way people are like, we're watching, you're okay, keep smiling.
I
So
was
I feel
struck to
like
see if that was a flamingo over your shoulder in that picture. That's
it
what
is.
I was squinting.
It
I was
is. Yeah, I dog sat my minister's dog while she was on at a orphanage in Kenya, and she wanted to thank me, and she knew I love flamingos, and there was a native who was in a tent, and she said, do you have a flamingo feather or something like that? And he ripped the side of his tent off, and he painted flamingos, and he gave it to her, and that's the side of his tent. Yeah. So yeah,
Mm.
that's how it happens for me.
Yeah, those are the things that really make you wonder how they keep showing up like that at the times that they show up. So yeah, fascinating.
We did have a weird moment with a flamingo down here in Massachusetts. I don't know if you heard on the Cape, there was a flamingo on the beach. And
Mm.
they were floored and they couldn't imagine what had happened. They think he probably got caught in a storm and he was sighted a few times. But imagine if you were walking down the beach and you stumbled across a flamingo here. That would
Okay,
take
I
you.
would drop dead. I would drop dead because I'd be like, oh my gosh, even the flamingos are finding me.
He didn't make it quite up to Maine, but pretty close in Massachusetts.
Well, back to awe and wonder too. I think, you know, there's so many ways we can see awe and wonder, of course, through birds and nature, and we have our stories and different types of dreams and different kinds of encounters. But I also think that people who do amazing things are awesome, truly. It causes awe, and I am honestly in awe of your work because you've completely created something that you've gone into such new territory and created something so new. And when it was making me think of something that you said, it took a really long time, like you felt the call in you, but you went through all these different forms and different chapters in your life and all these different roles you played, and you were also pushed out of some other areas where you thought you were supposed to go. But these, sometimes I think when you're a trailblazer, starting something new, it takes a long time, a much longer time than people realize, because you're creating something that hasn't been before. And that's why probably it was supposed to take a long time, and so when the hawk shows up for you, this is something I deeply believe. When some of us who are true trailblazers, and it's taken a long time, and it's like, why can't, you've had so many obstacles and challenges trying to get there. And then you get these signs or these synchronicities, and it's just such a relief, such a breakthrough. Like when that
Yeah.
hawk came, it was such, there's something very powerful about what happens when something's taken so long and then finally it's right. And that fascinates me, the timing of
Yeah,
when
and
the hawk appeared.
I really appreciate what you're saying because this was not a straight path. This was, taking on a little challenge here and learning about stuff and then putting it, in my thinking cap and letting it, brew and making mistakes and having setbacks, but not giving up. And then just, okay, if this path isn't open, there must be a path this way. You're right. So it takes a long time for things to percolate and take shape. And I think that's what's interesting about the story of the hawk is that it was sort of that validation that all of that pain and it wasn't all pain. I mean, I recall that, you know, obviously I still have some work to do around it, but um, there were delightful challenges along the way. Like someone said, well, why don't you volunteer at hospice? And then the hospice ended up hiring me, and that was such gratifying work. And then I did response for the Red Cross on a volunteer basis, and that was incredible work. But all of those things kind of shaped me as I went. And it couldn't have happened without all of those. And then sort of having that experience as I was ordained by Chime was like, oh, that's what all of this meant.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you, Laurie, for sharing tonight. I think this is a really interesting and different video than we've done before. So I think the viewers will get a lot out of it. And I know Val will put all your information underneath the video so people can read more about you and the work that you do. So I so appreciate everything that you do for everyone in Maine and whoever else you've touched out there. So thanks, Laurie.
Oh, you're
Thank you.
welcome. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.